The Lost Envelope. Mark was a quiet man who loved books. He worked at the Central City Library, a large wooden building in the middle of town. The library was very old, and it smelled like coffee and paper. Mark liked his job because every single day felt like a calm journey through different stories. It was a cold Tuesday afternoon in November. Outside, the rain was falling gently, and the streets were quiet. Mark was alone in the historical section of the library. His task for the afternoon was to organize the oldest books on the top shelf, books that were rarely read by anyone. He took a ladder, climbed up carefully, and pulled out a heavy black book with silver letters on the cover. The title was Stories of the Old City, published in 1978. As Mark took the book down, something fell from between the pages. It was a brown envelope. Mark climbed down the ladder and picked up the envelope. It was not sealed with glue, but closed with a faded red ribbon. On the front, a name was written in dark blue ink. To Eleanor. Mark turned the envelope over. There was no stamp, no address, and no return name. He looked around the library, but nobody was watching him. Curiosity filled his mind. The paper looked very old, perhaps 40 years old. Who was Eleanor? Mark whispered to himself, and why was this letter hidden in this book? He carefully untied the red ribbon. Inside, there was a folded piece of paper and a small, rusted key. The letter was dated October 14th, 1982. Mark sat down at his wooden desk near the window, adjusted his reading glasses, and began to read. Dear Eleanor, if you are reading this, it means I could not tell you the truth in person. I am leaving the city tonight. I know you are angry with me, but everything I did was to protect our project. The map is safe. I have left the second clue at our favorite place, the small cafe near the old harbour clock tower. Ask the barista for the blue notebook. The key inside this envelope opens the wooden box behind the counter. Please forgive me. I hope we meet again one day. Yours, Julian. Mark read the letter twice. His heart began to beat a little faster. He looked at the small, rusted key in his hand. It was real. The letter was real. Mark looked at his watch. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The library was closing in 2 hours. He had a choice. He could put the letter back in the book and forget about it, or he could go to the old harbour and see if the cafe still existed. He looked out the window at the rainy street. He decided to go. Mark put on his heavy coat, took his umbrella, and left the library. The rain was stronger now, but he did not mind. He walked quickly toward the lower part of the city, where the old harbour was located. 30 years ago, the harbour was a busy commercial area full of sailors, fishing boats, and markets. Today, most of the old buildings were renovated into modern apartments, fancy restaurants, and art galleries. Mark wondered if the cafe from 1982 was still there. He reached the harbour square after 20 minutes of walking. In the middle of the square stood the old stone clock tower. It was covered in green ivy, but the big clock was still moving. Next to the tower, tucked between a modern clothing shop and a bakery, was a small, narrow building. Above the entrance, a wooden sign swung in the wind. The Clock Tower Cafe, established 1975. Mark smiled. The cafe was still there. He opened the door, and a small brass bell rang above his head. The air inside was warm and smelled of cinnamon and freshly roasted coffee beans. The interior had not changed much. There were dark wooden tables, old photographs on the walls, and soft jazz music playing in the background. Behind the counter stood an old man with white hair and a kind face. He was wiping a coffee cup with a clean cloth. Good afternoon, the old man said warmly. Welcome to the Clock Tower Cafe. A warm cup of coffee on a rainy day? Hello, Mark said, walking up to the counter. He felt a little nervous. Yes, coffee would be great, please. Black, no sugar. Coming right up, the man replied. Mark took a deep breath. He remembered the line from Julian's letter. He lowered his voice slightly. "Excuse me, by any chance, do you have the blue notebook?" The old man stopped wiping the cup. He slowly raised his eyes and looked at Mark with great surprise. Silence filled the small cafe for a few seconds. "The blue notebook?" the old man asked slowly. "I haven't heard that name in more than 40 years. Who sent you, young man?" "Nobody sent me," Mark explained. "I am a librarian. I found a letter today in an old book at the town library. It was written by a man named Julian, addressed to Eleanor." The old man's eyes widened. He sat down on a stool behind the counter and sighed deeply. "Julian," the old man muttered. "I never thought I would hear his name again." "My name is Arthur," the old man said, offering his hand. Mark shook it politely and introduced himself. "I opened this cafe in 1975, Arthur continued, looking around the walls of his shop. "Julian and Eleanor were my best customers back then. They were young architects working for the city council. They were brilliant, enthusiastic, and very close friends." "What happened to them?" Mark asked eagerly. "In 1982, the city was planning a huge construction project," Arthur explained. "They wanted to destroy the old historic quarter near the river to build a modern highway. Julian and Eleanor were totally against it. They discovered that under the old quarter there was an ancient underground network of tunnels and Roman arches. If the city built the highway, those historical ruins would be destroyed forever." Arthur stood up and walked to a small wooden cabinet behind the counter. He pulled out a small, dusty wooden box bound with iron straps. "Julian came here one rainy night in October 1982, Arthur said softly. He was terrified. He said someone from the construction company was following him because he had the original blueprints of the ancient underground tunnels. He asked me to keep this box and told me that Eleanor would come for it. But Eleanor never came, and Julian disappeared that very night." Arthur placed the small box on the counter in front of Mark. "Julian told me that only the person with the key could open it," Arthur said. "Do you have the key, Mark?" Mark took the small, rusted key out of his pocket and placed it beside the box. It fitted the small keyhole perfectly. Mark turned the key carefully. With a soft click, the lock opened. Inside the box lay a small notebook with a blue leather cover, a folded map of the city's underground tunnels, and a yellowed black and white photograph. The photograph showed a young man with messy hair and glasses, smiling next to a young woman with dark curls. On the back of the photo it said, "Julian and Eleanor, summer 1981. Mark opened the blue notebook. The first page contained a list of addresses and dates. Attached to the last page was a modern business card. Mark read the name on the card out loud. "Eleanor Vance, Director of City Heritage and Architecture." Arthur gasped. "Eleanor? She is still in the city. She became a famous historic preservation expert." "We need to find her," Mark said firmly. Arthur looked at the business card. "Her office is at the City Heritage Museum, just 3 streets away from here. But Mark, this letter is 40 years old. Why didn't Eleanor ever get Julian's message?" Mark looked at the blue notebook. Julian left the letter in the library book, probably expecting Eleanor to find it, or someone to deliver it. But the book was returned to the top shelf, and nobody picked it up until today. Mark carefully packed the blue notebook, the map, and the photograph into his bag. "I am going to the museum now, Arthur. Would you like to come with me?" Arthur looked at his empty cafe, then turned off the coffee machine and picked up his hat. "Yes," he said with a smile. "I have waited 40 years to know how this story ends." Together, Mark and Arthur walked through the rainy streets to the City Heritage Museum. The museum was a grand marble building with high columns. When they arrived, the main hall was quiet. They approached the reception desk and asked to speak with Ms. Eleanor Vance. "Do you have an appointment?" the young receptionist asked politely. No, Mark said, but please tell her that we have something that belonged to Julian, from October 1982. The receptionist looked confused, but she made a quick phone call. A minute later, she looked up with wide eyes. Ms. Vance is waiting for you on the 3rd floor, office 302. Mark and Arthur took the elevator to the 3rd floor. They walked down a long hallway lined with historical maps and photos of the city. When they reached door 302, Mark knocked gently. Come in, a clear voice said from inside. They opened the door. Sitting at a large wooden desk surrounded by stacks of books and architectural models was an elderly woman with short grey hair and intelligent brown eyes. She stood up slowly as they entered. Mark recognized her immediately from the black and white photo. It was Eleanor. Good evening, Eleanor said, looking at Mark and then at Arthur. Her eyes stopped on Arthur, and her face filled with recognition. Arthur, is that really you? Hello, Eleanor, Arthur said warmly. It has been a long time. Eleanor invited them to sit down. Mark placed the brown envelope, the rusted key, the blue notebook, and the photograph on her desk. Eleanor reached out with trembling hands. She picked up the old black and white photograph of herself and Julian. Tears filled her eyes. Where did you find this? She asked softly, her voice shaking. Mark told her the whole story, about finding the letter hidden in the old library book, reading Julian's message, going to the Clock Tower Cafe, and opening the box with the rusted key. Eleanor listened in complete silence. When Mark finished, she let out a long breath. In October 1982, Julian and I had a big argument, Eleanor explained, looking out the window. We knew the city wanted to destroy the ancient underground ruins. Julian wanted to publish the secret maps in the newspaper immediately. I was afraid. I thought we would lose our jobs or get into trouble. The next day, Julian vanished. I looked for him everywhere, but no one knew where he had gone. I thought he was angry with me and had left the city forever. He wasn't angry, Mark said softly, pointing to the letter. He was trying to protect you and the discovery. Eleanor read Julian's letter carefully. A sad, beautiful smile appeared on her face. So he didn't abandon me, she whispered. He left the map for me to finish our work. What happened to Julian after that night? Arthur asked gently. Did you ever hear from him again? Eleanor nodded slowly and smiled. Yes, actually. 10 years later, in 1992, I received a letter from Canada. Julian had moved there and started a new life as an environmental researcher. He explained that he had to leave quickly back in 1982 because of threats from the construction developers. But he never knew what happened to his letter in the library. We reconnected and remained good pen pals for many years until he passed away peacefully 5 years ago. Eleanor opened the blue notebook and looked at Julian's handwriting with deep affection. Because of the underground maps Julian saved, Eleanor continued, looking up at Mark and Arthur, I was able to convince the city government in 1990 to protect the old quarter. Today, those ancient Roman tunnels are a protected national heritage site. Julian's courage saved the history of our city. Eleanor looked at Mark and took his hand warmly. Thank you, Mark. You brought me a missing piece of my youth tonight. A librarian's curiosity restored a lost memory. Mark smiled. He looked at Arthur, then at Eleanor, and finally at the old photo on the desk. The mystery was solved. The old envelope had finally reached its destination, and 3 strangers were now connected by a 40-year-old story. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the city lights shone brightly through the clear night sky.